Hi, I'm Meg Rivers, and I am here with Aaron. Aaron, could you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Hi, my name is Aaron Weinstein. I'm the Senior Director of Validation Services at IPS, and I've been with IPS for 23 years.
Let's talk about Annex 1 changes. What triggered those changes, do you think?
Annex 1, the last time it was updated was in 2008. So that's 14 years where there have been technology changes and design changes, and just the way that people approach aseptic and sterile fill has really changed over the years. And so in order to keep pace with that, the EMA said, hey, we've got to look and we've got to update that. So in 2017 they said, let's sit down and try to do this. Well, it took about 5 years, and it's definitely been in the making. In some cases, they really wanted to focus on aspects of contamination control, very much so, because they found there were contamination issues in the industry, and somehow that was increasing, and they really had to figure out a way to refocus industry on contamination control.
On a high level, what was impacted most by Annex 1?
First of all, let's just talk about the sheer size of Annex 1. Annex 1 was 16 pages in 2008. It is now 59. So they have significantly increased the amount of just simply the volume of the work. But there have also been other changes. There's been changes around scope. They are specifically saying, hey, this is meant for sterile medicinal products. However, you may have a low bioburden product like biological API, and they encourage companies to take a look at what it might apply, figure that out, put it down, document it, and then they'll view you as compliant with what they're doing. That's the scope that they're looking at. And they also decided to change the format. Now the format actually has sections, very specific sections, where they deal with subject matter. And on top of all that, it overlaps with their basic requirements that the EMA has for all GMP. So they wanted to show this as enhancing the basic GMPs for sterile medicinal products.
One of the most significant changes was the contamination control strategy. Can you explain what that is and maybe the expectations of the EU?
So the contamination control strategy is an overarching document strategy, really, that is required by the EMA. And in Annex 1, they decided to take this and make it a fundamental aspect of how they're going to evaluate your facility. It is facility specific, and the intent is for companies to come in and to take all of the aspects of contamination control, whether it is manufacturing, QC, material handling, design, installation, qualification, validation. You're supposed to take all of those into account, your procedures, your batch records, put it all together and show and demonstrate how each one of those items are going to control the contamination that you've identified through risk assessments. Quality risk management is considered to be a very large part of that. They want you to understand, because you went through a process of understanding the risks to your facility and to the product, and they want you to go in and say, all right, this is how we're going to do this. We know these are the issues. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to use a cross-functional team. That is absolutely important and imperative as to part of this process. And we are going to sit down and demonstrate, number one, we've identified the issues. Number two, we have identified the ways we're going to mitigate them. Then the expectation is that you implement them and demonstrate that you did implement them. And then finally, the expectation is that you assess that. One of the things they say is they're looking for continuous improvement on all of these other things. They have 16 items that they want you to look at, and the bottom one, 16, is continuous improvement. So they want to see you do that across that. So evaluate your system on a regular basis and understand how you are going to continue to control contamination and thus reduce the risk to patients.
How much would you say, if at all, that this is going to impact the overall timeline for manufacturers?
It does depend on the manufacturer, because one of the things they do state in there is that the contamination control strategy isn't something where you have to sit down and go back to page one. So if you already have a relatively mature system and you understand some of the contamination control strategy that you already have, but you didn't necessarily put that all into an overarching strategy that you can then present to a regulator, you might have a shorter curve there. It might take you less time because then it's really just sitting down and compiling these things together because you've been doing the risk assessments that regulators have been looking for years. And you've been doing these, the contamination control, and you understand your procedures. So the more you understand your system and how it controls contamination, thus preventing harm to a patient, the better you'll be. If you are a very, very new facility, then here's a good time to sit down and take a look at these things and to evaluate it and start that process, make it part of the company culture. Larger companies or companies that have been around for a while but have not been doing these things, have been flying a little bit more by the seat of their pants, will have a harder time. They may have some things in place, others not. And I think from a scramble standpoint, that's going to be something. They do have until next year to implement this and be ready. So they do have a full year until August of 2023.
So far as I understand, CGMP or GMP is relative. Whatever CGMP is, it's a lot of times it's based on what that particular company implements. Would you say Annex 1 is almost defining GMP or CGMP or putting more parameters around it?
It's the last one.
They're
definitely spending some more time explaining the parameters around CGMP because, like I said, you now have 59 pages, and a lot of what they filled that with is specific expectations from everything from sterilization to a facility to processing, and so they've spent more time with it. So I think they've spent more time putting some more specificity around things so that you could sit down and say, okay, I have a better target and something around that. That's what I really think the purpose of these particular things is. They're not redefining GMP. In fact, from their standpoint, the basic GMPs are already written, and they're not. Those are back up on the rest of it. What they are saying is that for Annex 1, for contamination control in a sterile medicinal facility, these are our expectations, and we're giving you a lot more to work with.
Okay, so more of having very specific outlines versus leaving room for interpretation.
Yeah, but again, 59 pages doesn't cover it all, right? Within a certain area, this is what we expect, whatever those areas are. But what they keep repeating over and over again, and contamination control strategy is mentioned over 50 times in this thing, in reference to this is a consideration for contamination control, this is a consideration. What they're saying there is understand the risk. The first thing we want you to understand is what areas of your design, construction, commissioning, qualification, validation, process, procedures, cleaning, what areas of that present a risk and how are you going to mitigate them? Once they see that and you've met the basic standards for the things they put out there, then you're on your way to satisfying their expectations for a sterile medicinal facility.
What are some of the updates to the barrier systems and expectations?
In the original, they talked about isolators and discussed that as a potential for a way to reduce risk. But it was a few paragraphs and then they were done. In this case, they sat down and they said, first of all, we're going to talk about barrier technology. For the first time, they're mentioning RABs, restricted access barrier systems, and making them distinct from isolators. And even within isolators, talking about closed systems versus open isolators, as they're calling them. And what they've done is they've said, okay, here are the basic expectations. And they went off into, they said, this is barrier systems and some basic expectations. Then they went into very specific subjects for each one. And so they would say, okay, this is glove materials and glove testing. These are our expectations for both systems. They would talk about decontamination, and they're very clear with isolator systems that this has to be automated and validated. That's how these have to go. They talked about the design of these systems and what kind of defining that. And they also talked about the background expectations, like what is your area supposed to be? Are you supposed to be in a B? Are you supposed to be in a C? Are you supposed to be in a D? For example, the D environment is acceptable for truly closed isolator systems. I know open isolator sounds funny, but closed isolator systems are sealed off and then you start your process. But whereas open isolators, they're still sealed off, but they have mouse holes and tunnels that you can get in and out of. with product, process, and everything else like that. So in that case, their actual requirement is a C background, a grade C background.
How have they updated the requirements for environmental monitoring?
Again, that's another area where they spent a bit more time. One of the things they did was really come out and say, look, you need to understand the viable particulates, non-viable particulates, things that were in there before. But what they made clear was, as you go through that, no one of these things, your cleaning, in addition, your cleaning and other items, your routine monitoring, no one of these is acceptable to say that your system is under control, that your facility is under control, and that you're meeting the requirements. All four of them, all of those have to come together in a way that show a robust piece. If any one of them is faltering, then even if the data shows, oh, even though these aren't as great, we're still robust, they don't view that as robust. You have to put all of that together. Another aspect of the environmental monitoring updates was around their expectations for trends. You have to put that into your procedures, how to trend, what trends mean. You have to define all of that. So when you are trending, there's a lot less guesswork around what is positive, what is negative, what are we going to do with negative, and they really expect you to think through that while you're putting together your procedures for environmental monitoring.
How did they expand the section for sterilization?
They went big, except radiation, where they went actually smaller. They spent less time on radiation. I have a theory. My theory is that it's not used quite as often. Removing certain things that didn't make sense allows for the flexibility for a group that's doing that to truly define the system, identify the risks and everything else like that without necessarily a certain type of constraint. But again, they might view that as lower risk only because it's not quite as many that you would use that. So around moist heat and depyrogenization, they've expanded those significantly. They start to talk a lot more about not just using an autoclave to terminally sterilize a product, but they talk about how autoclaves terminally sterilize porous hard goods, which are used in the process itself. So these aren't products, that they're part of the process. It talks about steam in place. They actually approached this, which they did not before, and talked about the fundamental aspects of what they expect for that, particularly around qualification, design, and ongoing monitoring of that. They also talked about superheated water being utilized for systems that would not stand up to normal terminal sterilization under the steam cycles, and what the expectations are for that sort of piece. Around depyrogenation, which is basically just heated air, and the depyrogenation ovens, they set again similar expectations. First of all, they talk about it and they spend some time on that, a bit more than they did in the original guidance, and they set what they expect for validation. That they say you have to, when you do validation, you actually have to have endotoxin spiked material, and you have to account for that endotoxin spiked material because endotoxins are very bad. And so when you go through your process of validating it, you have to make sure that those pieces are accounted for by the end so that you haven't left anything that would cause any potential problems. So, and that's just part of it. They really do spend some time. And then ethylene oxide, they still say that's their least favorite from all of them. I know that's not the word they use, but that's very clear that they view that as the least favorite method for doing it. But what they did say was, all right, here are the parameters. This is what we expect. This is what we consider critical parameters at a minimum. So things like the concentration of it, the duration of the cycle, the amount of ethylene oxide used, how long it takes to get out of that which is something that is clearly a toxic environment, and back out. For those of us on the CQV side, particularly the validation side, there's a lot there to work with. Now, of course, there are still some things up for interpretation and the way it all goes. But I would definitely say, no matter what, go back and look at your risk, understand your risk, and if you can back that up, if you can actually show that, that's what they want to see. And so if you decide to tweak something, do something a little bit different, as long as you've backed it up with the data and the assessment, you'll at least be in a good situation to sit and talk through that with a regulator.
It seems that a lot of expectations have been defined and processes perhaps have been changed. If it's 1 year from today when everything needs to be implemented, do you feel that that's enough time, and what tips do you have for companies that are like, okay, we need to make some changes?
My recommendation is, number one, if you do not have a CCS and you haven't even thought about a contamination control strategy yet, this is a very good time to sit down and start to do that. Start to create your cross-functional teams. Even if you're a small organization, while that may feel like, oh, I don't have enough people for a cross-functional team, you definitely can sit down and say, all right, how do we get someone in to work with it and help us sort of wrangle ourselves so we get these things done and everyone can continue their day job. If you're a large organization, you've probably already started this thought process and you've been through it. But if you're struggling with it, again, just trying to get everyone together in this time, sometimes people aren't in the office, that kind of thing, and being able to have some help managing that is something you should think about it and look to, because putting that all together can be a specialized skill set. And if you're already a mature organization who's kind of got their act together around it, you're going to be fine around this. And that's just around the CCS. For some of these other things, I will say this, I think industry's been doing some of it for a while. I don't think it's just completely new. It's just taking what everyone kind of knew and put it down into paper. Understand what you're doing, understand areas that you know need improvement, put that down, put timelines on them, and stick to those timelines. And even if it's after the next year, they might come in and say, all right, we see you're heading in the right direction. We'll come back and we'll see how it's going. Versus just, oh, I'm frozen. We don't know what to do. We'll just keep on going. If you don't have these elements, if you're looking at things and saying, wow, I am creating a sterile product and I am not meeting these, it's a real good time to say, how are we going to show that we're going to get it done?
If companies are stuck and they're like, I'm just not going to make it in a year, what resources do you recommend to get the ball rolling?
One of the biggest resources you could have, especially for this, is first sit down and understand, when I'm looking at a cross-functional team, do I have that cross-functional team? Do I truly have everybody that I would need? So that's your first part, to look at that. And I'm focusing on the CCS, obviously, and put that together. And once you've got that together, you should say to yourself, okay, do I have someone that can run this? Because sometimes that's the absolute no. I have people that they're already running their own job and all that. So then looking out for additional resources, or a resource that can come in and help sort of put that all together and keep everyone focused and moving forward is one of the keys. If you are having specific issues associated with something like cleaning or cleaning validation or anything along those lines, or even design of your facility, how do we get there? Reach out. There are many organizations, good solid organizations such as ours, that can come in and sit down and say, okay, here's where you're at, here's where you want to be, how are we going to get there, how are we going to use what may be limited resources to do that, and set that tone so that, again, so that when you finally have to talk to somebody from a regulatory standpoint, you have your act together, even if not everything is quite complete.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aaron, for sharing your insight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Meg, for the time.